All right, we move on to chapter 6, remembering that as we left the last session, the people in Santoff Clausen heard a terrible, ground-trembling, ferocious roar. We shall find out. But first, in chapter 6, we are introduced to Nikolas St. North, a most likely unsource of help, as the subtitle of the chapter goes. And this is the person that we watch who we can see transformed by the power of love. Transformed by the power of love. And as far as I'm concerned, this is what we are being entertained with or being informed with, or what the author has so wonderfully drawn forth in these tales. Nikolas St. North. Later that night, in the raggedy camp of the wildest ruffians of the Russian plains, there slept a young bandit chief named Nikolas St. North. No one knew exactly how old he was, for even he did not know his birthday. But he was old enough for the beginnings of a beard and was, without argument, the most daring young rascal in all the Russias. A hero he was not, but it was said that he once defeated an entire regiment of cavalry with a bent steak knife while he was eating. Impressive swordsmanship indeed, but not the kind of achievement that would make a mother proud. North had no mother or father or family that he could remember. He had never been tucked into bed. He'd never known the safety of a home or the tenderness of a mother's embrace, nor the happy camaraderie of a father's company. His boyhood was spent in the wilds, aware of himself only as both predator and prey, both hunter and hunted. There are skills that develop when one grows up forgotten and wild: keen eyes, light steps, impossible quickness. These skills would become North's native tongue, that and a preternatural sense of where danger lies. As a boy, he fled from that feeling, but as he grew older, he pursued it. Trees produce growth rings for each birthday, but North had no way to mark the time that had passed. He was somewhere in his teens, though, when he was taken in by the Cossacks, the most savage tribe of warriors in the Russian Empire. Soon, North became their greatest fighter. With dirk, dagger, or pistol, he was matchless. They taught him their language, and then he charmed them out of rations, supplies, and common sense. It would be logical to assume that a taste of civility, if one can call the Cossacks civil, it would be logical to assume that a taste of civility would tame the lad. But North remained just as wild, only now, having learned from these warriors, he was more cunning, powerful, and well-fed. I think I heard recently that the Cossacks actually were an outgrowth of the Ukrainian people who became Ukrainian. Still, along with these dubious qualities, there came a ready smile. Life is made up of danger and heartbreaking boast. I laugh in the face of both. Yet, for all his humor and charm, North thought of no one but himself, caring only for the thrill of battle and the pursuit of treasure. The Cossacks were, at heart, a cruel bunch, and North, even with his meager moral outlook, could not abide their disregard for human life. And so he had left the Cossack Brotherhood to become a bandit, the most notorious in Europe. Never caught, always at the ready, he and his ragtag band of outlaws had plundered half the wealth of the continent. But the money never lasted long. They gambled and wasted it away almost as quickly as they stole it. North was, in fact, this night, sound asleep and dreaming of just how to steal the other half of the continent's riches when a moonbeam, sent by the man in the moon himself, shined down into the bandits' camp. It darted from outlaw to outlaw, flickering to the ear of Sergei the Terrible. Nope, wrong thief. Putin the Creepy, not right either. Then Gregor of the Mighty Stink. Yikes, wrong again. Then finally it found North. Ah, yes, the bandit prince. In perfect Russian, the moonbeam began to transmit the message, the story dream that the man in the moon suspected would entice young North. Nikolas St. North mumbled and squirmed in his sleep, trying to swat the moonbeam away, but the beam persisted. This was a very important mission, and when it finally managed to embed the story dream in North's sleeping mind, it darted back into the sky. If anyone in the camp had been awake at the time, they would have seen North with his eyes shut, cocking his head from side to side for several minutes, as if listening to an astounding tale. Then North began to laugh, a loud, deep, rumbling laugh that went on and on. It grew louder and fuller until it woke his men. They looked at their leader in surprise. He still was not awake, but he was still laughing away. Finally, even the horses began to stir, and of all who were there, only North's horse, Petrov, had the courage to approach. His fellow thieves all respected Nikolas, admired him even, and would follow him anywhere. But he was rash and unpredictable, and most definitely not the type of person you woke up. Petrov, however, walked calmly through the camp and stood over his master. He was a smart horse, smarter than most of North's men. With a quick shake of his head, he managed to drop the ends of his reins onto North's laughing face. And the bandit chief awoke. But his laughter did not stop. It only grew louder. Still laughing, he leaped to his feet, grabbed two pistols from his sash belt, and fired them into the air. Then, with a single jump, he landed in Petrov's saddle, grabbed the reins, and rode off into the darkness without saying a word. His men squatted by the campfire, baffled by North's strange departure. Then, one by one, they rose up, mounted their own horses, and rode into the black night after their leader. Dark it may have been, certainly too dark to see, but that didn't matter. They could still hear the laughter, and they knew by its tone that Nikolas St. North was leading them to adventure and riches beyond anything they'd ever dreamed of. Chapter 7 is not really a chapter at all, just a piece of the greater puzzle. On a craggy mountaintop high above the Russian wilderness, that boy, that spectral boy who braved the fearlings and shadows, hid from the moonlight. He peeked out from between boulders left behind by ancient glaciers, then instantly hunkered back down into the darkness. The moon knew he was there. A handful of moonbeams danced about the rocks as if teasing him out. The boy peeked again, drew back, then couldn't resist one more look. The beams bounced from rock to rock, and slowly, hesitantly, the boy stepped forward into the light and gazed up at the moon. For once, he stood perfectly still, staring intently at the moon's glowing orb. He began to recognize the face, a face from long ago. It was the face of his oldest and dearest friend, whom he had not seen since the fateful battle with Pitch. Dozens, then hundreds of moonbeams shined down and danced around the boy. The wind began to pick up, and misty mountain clouds swirled by him, not but an arm's length away. The moonbeams started to strobe and flicker. The beam trapped inside the boy's diamond-tipped staff flashed excitedly. The staff began to shake in the boy's hand. He brought it to his face and looked closely at the beam. It seemed to speak to him. He instinctively raised the staff to the sky. The moonbeams around him then focused on the diamond. In fevered bursts of light, they appeared to celebrate the finding of their lost comrade. Messages were apparently being sent and received. Then the staff pulled the boy towards the passing clouds. As a brilliant glow filled the air, the boy stepped right off the edge of the mountain peak, but he did not fall. As his foot reached the open air, it landed upon one of the clouds that was soaring by. The spectral boy took one step, then another. He looked down around himself. He was standing on a cloud. The next instant, he was running, bounding from cloud to cloud, faster than seemed possible. He was smiling as no boy, spectral or otherwise, has ever smiled before. Chapter 8, where the impossible occurs with surprising regularity. Nikolas St. North and his men rode all night, but it was a most unnatural evening. North's laughter had finally subsided, but still he charged relentlessly south like a cheerful madman. The moon seemed to light the way for them, leading them through the darkest gorges and densest forests. After several hours at a hard gallop, they came to a river that was too swift to cross. Before the bandits could even slow down, they saw a streaking figure. Was it a boy made of light? There followed a dazzling flash that illuminated the water in a strange, otherworldly way. North peered at the river, his instincts kicking in. He was a betting lad after all, and he sensed that these moonbeams were coaxing him to trust in the impossible. With a nudge, he urged Petrov forward, and they strode right on to the river. They did not sink, but rode atop the water. North's men dashed after them. It was like that again and again. Lakes, streams, fjords, any body of water that blocked their path would light up and magically support them. And then, as they climbed high into the mountains, something even more astounding occurred. At the edge of a steep escarpment, the mountain sheared off into nothingness. What do you think? North pulled on Petrov's reins. The horse reared back just in time to avoid a plummeting drop. North surveyed the edge. Below them was nothing but clouds. What do you think? If they pressed ahead, they'd fall. There was no telling how far, but it was certain death. Then there it was again, that glowing boy, the burst of light coursing through the clouds. And yet again, North laughed out loud. He cracked Petrov's reins and they raced forward. Before his men could shout for him to stop, he'd hurtled off the edge. North and Petrov fell a few feet, then landed on a cloud. They rode on, North now laughing with reckless joy. Stunned, his men soared after him, and they too began to laugh at the wild, fantastic folly of what they knew was impossible. And yet, there it was happening. There it was happening. On and on they rode through these new cloud mountains and valleys, across the white glistening landscape of the air. Chapter 9, they rode into Chapter 9, the Battle of the Bear. The enchanted clouds sloped past the high hills just outside of Santoff Clausen. North and his men skidded down the last cloud's wavy edge, and jumped to the solid ground just below. Dawn was breaking. The sky was just beginning to brighten with hints of purple and blue. North barreled forward, urging Petrov toward a dense wooded grove that he suspected surrounded a village. For it was this village he was headed toward, the village called Santoff Clausen, as he'd explained to his men as they thundered through the night. Riches, lad! Riches, lads! He'd bellowed out. I saw it all in a dream. Treasures like we've never seen, not by a half, not by a tenth, and there are ours to find. He'd warned they'd be tested. Vines with thorns that can cut you in two, trees with roots like lashes, a bear 30 feet tall. One of his men shouted out, but Captain, no bandit has ever faced those defenses and lived. North let out a great ha. He paused only for an instant. We are no ordinary bandits. Then he cracked his leather crop and stormed onward. Now, just ahead of the sun, the men quickened toward the row of titanic oaks that lined the outer edge of the forest, their huge roots rising up and blocking any path inside. North did not flinch. With Petrov at a full gallop, he rode straight at them. At the last moment, the mountainous roots groaned. The mountainous roots groaned to life. They arched and shifted like prehistoric serpents, forming an entrance large enough for North and his men to ride through. North was sure this was a sign. The village's defenses are already surrendering, he thought. Perhaps the defenses know exactly who they are up against. The forest fears us, lads, he crowed. With whip and spur, they galloped on. They rushed through the vast, heaving tumult of tree roots, then hurtled into a barbed tangle of giant vines. The vines untwined their centuries of knotting and let them pass. North glanced at the retreating vines, spear-like thorns with disdain. This was almost too easy. He grinned back triumphantly at his men. Now bring on the bear. The first streams of sunlight began to flicker through the fortress of limbs and tree trunks. North could make out the tracings of a well-worn trail, and farther ahead, the open knolls of the village. He raised his arm, urging his men onward, when a terrifying roar shattered the early morning quiet. The bear. The roar echoed out again, louder, closer. North drew his sword and rose up in his saddle, eager to see the beast. His men followed suit, so there was going to be a fight after all. But as they rounded a bend in the path, it was not a bear they saw at all. Wonder what it could be if it wasn't the bear. Blocking their way was a beautiful, misty figure. Ombrich's last line of defense, the spirit of the forest. Her shimmering veils laced with tiny gemstones shifted and floated around her as if moving to a breeze that only she could feel. The men reined in their horses and glanced at one another. Not even North's dream had told of this creature. The spirit beckoned them closer. As they neared, her eyes glowed and glistened, greener than the emeralds they'd once stolen from the Sultan of Constantinople. She seemed made of jewels, the most extraordinary they had ever seen. This must be the fabled treasure. Though the bear's bellows continued, the thieves heard only the jangling of the spirit's bracelets. North's men began to dismount their horses, mesmerized. They walked toward her, lowering their swords, but North was unsure. He looked in the direction of the bear's roar, then back again. A shaft of dawn's light illuminated the spirit, and her radiance was now blinding. Feeling hypnotized, even North could no longer pull his gaze from her. The world around him seemed to fall away as he imagined the treasure she must surely be guarding. She reached a pale hand toward him, then opened her slender fingers. Gold. North began to lower his saber, ignoring Petrov, who was shaking his mane in frustration. The spirit looked into North's eyes. She drifted forward, holding the gold coins higher. Then she held out both hands. Thousands of coins were spilling to the ground. The treasure was there for him, before him. The treasure was there before him. Thousands of coins spilling to the ground out of her hands. He need only take it. He wanted to take it. But Petrov reared up and slammed his hoofs against the ground. Suddenly, North could hear screaming from the village. He tore his eyes from the spirit. The roar of the bear and the panicked screaming flooding his ears. The screams were coming from children. It sounded as if they were screaming for their lives. The sound pulled at North's soul, reached into a place in his heart he did not know existed. And for the first time in his life, he turned away from treasure. He snatched up Petrov's reins and wheeled away from the glittering phantom. Lads, this way, he barked, but they were transfixed. Slapping the reins against Petrov's neck, North shot his men one last look, just in time to see them scrambling after the loose coins. To his horror, the moment their fingers grasped the coins, they turned to stone. Dashing bandits no longer, they froze into hunched, hideous trolls and elves. Don't worry, later in the story, much later, they get to come alive again. Before North could fathom what this meant, he heard the children's cries again. As in all moments of true bravery, North's heart beat so strongly that it filled his whole body with a steady, urgent pulse, flooding his head until there was no thinking, just action. The pounding of his heart was echoed by the drumming of Petrov's hooves as North raced toward the screams. The second chorus of screams rose up, and North urged Petrov even faster. But when they reached the town center, Petrov reared back. The scene before them was like something out of a nightmare. North had seen many things, but nothing in his young life to match this. A tree, an oak of staggering size, was actually fighting an enormous black bear. His muscles, the bear's, dense and flexed with aggression, rippled under an endless mass of fur. Tree's roots had torn from the ground and were thrashing and grabbing at the bear like an octopus. It swung a massive limb to strike at the bear, but the creature blocked the blow, snapping the branch off at the trunk and sending it crashing into a house. Then the bear clawed at the tree's trunk, digging holes that revealed the tree's hollow. It was there, inside the tree, where North saw the children, at least a dozen of them, cowering and terrified. In front of them stood an ancient wizard, madly waving a wooden staff, shouting what sounded like the beginnings of an incantation. But before the wizard could finish, the bear shredded away a huge swathe of bark and snatched the wizard from the hollow, gulping him down in one ferocious bite. The children burrowed deeper into the farthest notches of the tree, quivering. The tree gave a great shudder, and its roots and limbs fell limp. The bear sprang free. He eyed the children and raised a massive paw, but North had begun his charge. He had the advantage. He saw the bear, but the bear had not yet seen him. He rammed Petrov into the bear's black fur at full speed, knocking the brutish creature off balance. Drawing a second saber, North managed a half dozen deep wounds before the bear regained his footing. With a roar that shook the forest, the creature swung around faster than North ever thought possible. One single swipe was enough to fling thief and horse into the air. North landed in the tree's hollow. Though badly wounded, he did not falter. With the children huddled behind him, he stood his ground. "Our bear has gone mad," one of the children told him breathlessly. "Our Ombrick," came the teary voice of a young girl, "has been eaten." She choked on the words, struggling, he could tell, to contain a sob. "Then he'll eat no more," replied North, and braced for the bear's attack. The bear rose to his full height, casting a shadow over the bandit and the children. His claws were ready, his teeth bared. He let out a growl so low and ominous, North could feel it in his bones. For once, North did not laugh in the face of danger. With blinding speed, he threw 6 daggers, 3 from each hand, and riddled the bear with knives. Then he redrew his sabers and attacked. The bear struck back, but North was at the ready. In an instant, he'd sliced off the deadly tips of the bear's claws. The bear surged forward. North, both sabers in hand, plunged. It's his swords. The bear surged forward. North, both sabers in hand, plunged. But the bear was not done. He tossed North to the ground like a rag doll. The bandit, stunned, could not get up. The bear lunged at him, his full weight bearing down, but North was not finished either. He would not let that monster have the children. With what little strength he had left, he raised both sabers just as the bear's massive body slammed on top of him. The bear landed with the violence of a meteorite. The ground shook for miles. A cloud of dirt and earth mushroomed up, turning the morning sky ashen. In the silence that followed, the children looked out from the splintered gashes of Big Root. They could just make out the bear's huge shape through the haze of dust. He shifted and lurched, trying to get to his feet. His breathing was labored and short. With one long, mournful groan, he slowly rolled over and moved no more. As the air began to clear, the children gasped. The man with the swords lay on the bear's chest. Both sabers were jammed to the hilt in the black fur just above the behemoth's heart. The man lay unmoving as well. He looked so small and ragged, like a toy. In a daze, the children crept forward to stare at the valiant swordsman. Their world was shattered. Their beloved bear had turned into a monster and destroyed everything they held dear. But they wanted, somehow, to help this man who had so courageously saved them. Ombrick would know what to do. But Ombrick... Oh, some of the children began to cry softly. Others kneeled, reaching out to touch the crumpled man. And as they did so, a dark, shadowy mist began to rise up from the mouth of the bear. An inky mass began to form. It grew larger, sizzling and writhing in the morning light. Then it sharpened into a shape that towered above them. The children drew back. They'd seen this face before in the story Ombrick had showed them of the Golden Age. Looking down on them was Pitch himself. In his hands was Ombrick's carved staff broken in two. "This is all that's left of your precious wizard," he sneered. Chapter 10, in which a great many things occur swiftly. With no one to protect them, the children were certain they were doomed. Pitch leaned down closer. The children backed away. His face, his awful face, was a nightmare in itself. Not so much ugly as haunted, cold, without a hint of kindness. Centuries of cruelty reflected from his piercing stare. Yet there was a magnificence about him like that of an approaching storm. The children had never beheld any being that seemed so powerful. Not Ombrick, not their bear. They were frozen in a sort of mesmerized, terrible awe. Pitch leaned closer still. But as he did so, the children noticed something. Pitch seemed to be fading, growing dimmer as the morning sun reached past the trees, and then dimmer still. The children could barely believe what was happening. They didn't dare move. In time, Pitch whispered, wincing in the sunlight, in time you'll be mine. And in eerie silence, Pitch began to seep slowly into the ground. He tried desperately to hold on to the two halves of Ombrick's staff, but as he became more and more translucent, the pieces slipped through his hands and fell to the grass. Then, in a dank, smoky mist, Pitch dissolved into the earth until there was no trace of him at all. The terror gone, the children scrambled out of the remains of Big Root. They looked about wildly, and there, running toward them, flooding around them, enveloping them in their arms, were their parents. You're safe, one mother called out, tears falling onto the head of the small boy she clutched. I'm so sorry, cried a father. He trapped us in our sleep. We could hear your cries, but we couldn't move, murmured another mother, hugging her little girl tightly. Something happened to our bear, the tallest boy told them. Ombrick's been eaten, another boy sobbed. That man saved us and he's been killed, the girl hiccuped, pressing her face into her father's chest. But you're safe, the parents said again and again, and the joy of that started to turn sobs to smiles, wails to grins. Only little Catherine stood apart, pressing her lips together till they were pale. Then, with a slight tilt of her head, she left the group to join old William, the village elder. He stood over the place where Pitch had vanished. Only a small crack in the hardened dirt remained. He looked at the bear and the fallen hero who had defended the children. The old man shook his head. His was a sadness that was just beginning to sink in. Catherine took his hand, and soon one, then another of the villagers trickled over. They looked at the broken pieces of Ombrick's staff. How can this be? Whispered old William. And the joyful clamor of reuniting families began to give way to piercing grief. Some of the children started to lean against the bear's unmoving body, clasping and hugging his thick black fur. No, don't touch him, cried Fogg's father, pulling Fogg away. Tears welled up in the child's eyes. But he is our bear. Another child chimed in. He'd never hurt us on purpose. It wasn't his fault. That bad one changed him, said Catherine. Think of what he's been to us. Then everyone stopped and remembered. Not the bear's last terrifying moments of madness, but the years of devotion and friendship. The way he had protected them time and again. And what of Ombrick, Big Root? Were they lost forever? The sorrow began to spread. First, the trees ringing the outer rim of the village began to sway, their limbs sinking toward the forest floor. Then the rest of the forest followed, every inhabited, be it plant, insect, or animal, flooding the air with a heavy, woeful roll of sound as if the entire world were moaning. The sky darkened. The wind began to swell. Leaves began to snap away from the trees, the vines, and the bushes. Big Root was stripped of all its foliage. the swirling leaves circling around Santoff Clausen like a tempest of tears. Through the blur, the villagers could see something moving toward them. It was the spirit of the forest. She glided to them and hovered over Ombric's broken staff. She too was weeping, her jewels now dull, her tears falling on the staff's broken edges. The village would never be the same, that seemed certain. But Ombric's first lesson to anyone who lived in Santoff Clausen was simple. There's a little bit of wizard in everyone. That magic's real power was in belief. That every spell began, I believe, I believe, I believe. Old William picked up the two halves of Ombric's staff and fit them back together precisely along the break. He looked at Catherine intently. She instantly understood. Ombric's first lesson, she whispered. She ran her fingers along the break, smoothing the splinters down into the staff. I believe, I believe, I believe, she said. The deafening howl of grief from the villagers did not abate, but through the tumult, that first lesson came back to everyone. Old William, then others began to repeat the words, I believe, I believe, I believe, over and over, empowered by belief, the broken staff was made whole again. The atmosphere began to lighten in waves. The wind slowly stilled. The air became as quiet as a midnight snow. Time itself seemed to stop. The villagers could feel magic. The villagers could feel magic all around them. And when they opened their eyes, there stood Ombric, looking so very Ombric-like, as if nothing had happened at all. And behind him stood the bear. His wounds were gone, vanished, but his fur was now as white as a cloud, and in his giant front paws he held the man like a sleeping child. Ombric took the staff that Catherine, beaming brighter than even the sunlight, held up to him. Thank you for remembering, Ombric said. He ran his hands along the worn wood pensively, rubbing a thumb along the scar of the crack. Then he motioned to the man in the bear's arms. The wounded stranger helped save us. It would be rude to not return the favor. The wounded stranger helped save us. It would be rude to not return the favor. With a wave of his hand, Ombric started walking toward Big Root. In front of everyone's eyes, the tree began to revive. With Ombric's every step, new leaves budded forth and grew. With Ombric's every step, the shattered hearts of the villagers grew stronger. Magic had indeed returned to Santoff Clausen, and all of it would be needed to heal the young stranger who had saved their day. To be continued.